In the previous episode of Error Code, I talked with Mike Walker about the Hackasat program. We talked specifically about some of the orbital dynamics that will be required for the Capture the Flag team to be successful in this year's game. This year they're hacking a live satellite, Moonlighter, in orbit around the Earth. To give you an idea how different these games are, here's some of the challenges from the very first Hackasat in 2020.
Challenge 0. Here's what we know. An attacker has obtained access to the satellite's ground station through an internet-facing website. Once they obtained access, they kicked us out. The challenge? Teams must regain network access to the ground station. Here's how they do it. An internet-facing website exists on the same subnet as the ground station. Teams must identify and exploit a vulnerability in the web server, then use it as a foothold within the network to pivot to the ground station and gain access. Challenge number 1. Here's what we know. Having access to the ground station means we can attempt communication, but the satellite is spinning out of control, which complicates everything. The challenge. Teams must regain communication with the satellite. Here's how they do it. To get started, teams must set the command and telemetry rates appropriately and the power output to maximum. Because the satellite is spinning, additional link margin is required. The teams receive periodic telemetry, but are not able to command the vehicle. Based on the review of the anomaly resolution section in the user's guide, they realize that to increase the link margin, they should increase radio output power and decrease link rate. They command the radio to high power and low rate mode and regain communications with the satellite. The link is limited to low rate, meaning that what they can send and receive from the satellite is limited.
These challenges have evolved, and really, the teams have evolved along with the challenges. They're ready to start hacking a live satellite in orbit. This is the story of what's needed for the Capture the Flag competition at DEF CON 31 that will be hosted for the first time on a live satellite orbiting 400 kilometers above the Earth. I'm Robert Famosi. This is Error Code.
My name is Mike Walker. My hacker handle during Hackasat is Cydonia. And my experience, I have multiple degrees in aerospace engineering from Purdue University. And I have 15 years experience in aerospace and defense, doing modeling and simulation and embedded flight software. And my specialty areas kind of revolve around GPS and digital signal processing. Like that's where my degrees lie. But I've done a bunch of stuff over the years, sort of all over the embedded flight software and high fidelity physics modeling realm.
For many years, Legit BS was running DEF CON CTFs. That involves deciding on the type of play, either Jeopardy or King of the Hill, and then defining the challenges. Mike and his team are adding to that a lot of math. They're making the CTF a little more complicated for hackers.
Yeah, exactly. So, normally in CTFs, you're just talking about hacking some infrastructure that's on the ground. And with Hackasat, we put space physics into the mix, or as everyone loves to complain about, jokingly during the challenge, there's all this space math involved in order to do that you have to deal with in order to do attacks. So, I love the space math, which makes it fun for me.
In a normal DEF CON CTF, there are 16 teams in the final. There aren't that many for Hackasat.
So last year in Hackasat 3, we had 8 teams, but this year we've down selected to 5 teams that will be competing in the final event.
So there are 5 teams, but if I understand correctly, there's only one Moonlighter. How's that going to work?
This year, we only have one live satellite. Satellites are expensive. We've got to build them and then launch them, test them and launch them into space, right? That costs the U.S. government a lot of money and time. And that's a difference between this year and last year. In all the past years, everyone has sort of had their own asset that they could protect, and then they could attack other people's asset. This year, everybody will be on the same asset, which is Moonlighter, one asset in low Earth orbit.
So that's interesting. 1 satellite, not 5. And it seems one of the possible game scenarios might be that the teams compete over who gets control over the satellite.
Well, I won't give away the style of the game right yet because we haven't quite decided or released that information.
Fair enough. The teams will be notified shortly before the game what the criteria will be. But there are some baseline assumptions that we can make. For example, this Moonlighter software is representative of real satellite software. It's not training wheels or special CTF software.
The whole way through Hackasat, we have been using, systems that even NASA uses. Like a lot of the flight software we're using is part of NASA's core flight software, which they run on real satellites. But in some ways, things will be, we do need to simplify things in some respects to, so that they can be exploited and used during a 24 or 36-hour game. So there will be some simplification in the way we sort of present the game to the user or to the players. But it is still a real satellite, and we're giving them access to, I guess, an interface control, specification that is realistic. So it's going to be very realistic. We just have the needle we have to thread as game developers is what we give them access to and how we keep it in scope for the length of the game. Because if we just gave them full access to like a whole satellite and all the flight software on it, it would be too much, right, for the length of the game. So it's mostly, any non-realism is mostly about scope control of the game, at least in my opinion.
Given that this is a live satellite, for the qualifiers this year, and there were about 700 teams that competed to be one of the top 5 finalists, did Hackasat make any changes in anticipation of the live satellite event?
Didn't make any changes to the format of qualifiers. It stayed as Jeopardy, but we did introduce a new category called the Magician, and that category required you to upload binaries that sort of were executed by a service and then would download you back data instead of just interacting with the service directly via like SSH. And the idea behind that was to get people used to the idea that like you might need to upload a binary or a command set, and then it's going to happen in some time and you'll receive things back later, and you need to get used to that sort of mechanic. So we introduced people to that mechanic with the Magician category, where they had to, upload things to an asynchronous service. It would go use their upload and then return them data. And that category we think went really well. People played that a lot, and those challenges got a lot of solves. We think that especially the finalist teams should have gotten at least a brief introduction to this concept, right, of things happening asynchronously.
So the style for the qualifiers was Jeopardy. What does that mean? Well, there are 2 types of CTFs. One is Jeopardy, and like the TV show, there are categories across the top and levels of difficulty below. Teams have to work their way through the board to collect various points. That's perhaps the most common CTF style that you'll find. What you typically see at DEF CON CTFs in the finals there is the second style, which is known as King of the Hill or Attack and Defend. This is where teams attack other servers and defend their own for points.
But it is interesting to think about just from, we could speculate, right? Hosting a King of the Hill on a single asset might be interesting, or it might not be interesting. With all the physics involved to contact a satellite, you need to wait for a ground station to come into view. A traditional King of the Hill could be really exciting, or it could be really boring, right? One team might just get control, and then you don't have enough contacts to really fight each other, right? So those are the kind of things that we are considering in the game design, is how to make sure the game stays interesting when we have such limited contact windows to the satellite. You don't always get, you don't have full access to it all the time. We have to wait for it to come overhead of one of our, our dishes, and then we can send up commands to get telemetry. So I won't tell you what the game is, but it is an interesting problem to solve, how to keep it interesting when you don't have a lot of access to the satellite.
So in the previous episode of Code, Mike and I discussed some of the basic space physics confronting this challenge. such as the teams and admins alike only have a limited amount of time to contact the satellite as it passes a given ground station. And even then, there's limited bandwidth available for uploads and downloads. This isn't some simulation. This is real. But this shouldn't be too surprising. Legitimate BS, they're known for taking risks at the DEF CON finals. I recalled when Legitimate BS would introduce something that, well, may not have been done before. Like the one year they introduced Clemency, an operating system based on Middle Indian, which means the teams first had to figure that out before competing. And for a lot of them, they had to throw out their tools that they had counted on using and create new ones on the fly. The point here is that Hackasat 4, hosting a game on a satellite in orbit, is a huge risk for admins and teams alike. I mean, it's a friggin' satellite in space. There could be communications problems. There could be satellite problems. There could be massive solar storm that fries every piece of circuitry. There could also be real-world problems that have nothing to do with the level of play or the challenges that have been created.
Yeah, absolutely. And you just brought up, what keeps me up at night about this challenge, right? And it's a lot of stuff. The first risk is launches don't go according to plan. And I'm not talking about, the launch failing because the rockets we're on are pretty reliable. It's outside chance that could happen. But there are weather delays. Things get, pushed back. You can get bumped off of your launch vehicle, although we don't think that's going to happen to us at this stage.
So Moonlighter is a CubeSat that was successfully launched on board CRS-28 on June 5th, 2023. So we can cross that worry off the list. It's in orbit. But still, there are other concerns that keep Mike up at night.
After that, you need your small satellite to be released, which takes more time. The people who control the release need to do it. After that, you need to bring your satellite through commissioning, which is you basically make sure everything is working correctly, right? You don't want to go running, your mission, which in our case is the cybersecurity game, without making sure everything works first. So you have to go through commissioning, and then we need to test our game. And all of that has to happen for us before DEF CON. So the schedule is pretty tight. But we're optimistic and things are on track, as far as we can tell.
So as I produce this episode, Mike and his team, they're heads down. They're checking everything to make sure the satellite and the game will be working in August for DEF CON 31. Even so, there are other concerns.
After that, there's a whole nother slew of problems that can happen in space, right? The first of which, I think you brought up contact windows. We're paying for time on a ground station network. However, a higher priority customer could come along. Somebody could be having an emergency with their satellite during our finals game. And we could technically get bumped from our ground stations, which would really put a wrench in the works, right? You're planning on this happening and it's just be like, oh, someone's having an emergency and you no longer get that contact window. You no longer get to use the antenna. So that's frightening from a game designer perspective. And then much more unlikely, small satellites aren't really designed with the same robustness as like a big GPS satellite. So, satellites like Moonlighter are more susceptible to things like space weather, and electromagnetic events that happen in the upper atmosphere and magnetosphere. But the good news is that we're running our game pretty quickly after launch, so the probability of that affecting us is rather low.
So we still haven't talked about what might be possible with the game. Let's talk a little bit more about attacks used in a past Hackasat.
Yeah, so in Hackasat 3, we gave them, I would call it a non-traditional attack. It was basically, we had this attitude, determination, and control system, and you could upload as a user control gains to it. And those gains let you tune how quickly your control system responds, right? Do you want, your satellite to slew at like 1 degree a second or 10 degrees a second or slower? And what we did is we didn't check the boundaries in flight software of any of those control gains. And you can set control gains to something that is unstable so that when you give it a command to point, the satellite will spin out of control and it'll never work. That's just how the math of control theory works. And normally, that's not necessarily a type of check you would do on the satellite. It's often something that's implemented on the ground station, right? Like we're gonna assume that the commands we send are good. And in a cyber, when you're thinking about attack, defense, CTF, the commands you send are almost certainly not always going to be good, right? So we allowed people to send these commands. The ADCS didn't have bounce checking. So, especially Poland can into space, our winner from last year, they sent a lot of, unstable control gains to other teams, causing their satellites to spin out and their flight processors to eventually crash. The control system had an integrator in it, and those unstable gains, if they were allowed to stay for too long, that integrator would overflow and actually crash your flight processor with a floating point exception, which was very interesting and actually kind of unexpected by us.
And there's also this possibility that the teams might actually find a 0 day on the satellite and try to exploit that, which might cause some instability in the game itself.
What's interesting is, this little check, like this little assumption that the messages we'll send up are good, that assumption and the attack that came from it caused a lot of chaos in the game. When your flight processor crashes and is now not responding to commands anymore, it's really hard to know what to do when you don't know why, right? So teams were just seeing their flight processors crash and they'd see that their satellite was out of control. And it was really interesting to see, the teams respond to that. And some of them were able to figure out what was going on and come up with mitigations, and others weren't. It was very, very interesting during last year's game to see that little attack we came up with sort of create this chaos and how teams dealt with it.
As Mike mentioned, even last year, with the digital twin simulating conditions in space, Hackasat admins had God mode, where they could intervene if necessary. Is there a risk then with this live satellite Moonlighter slipping out of control, spinning out of control, or wreaking havoc up there if somebody does something?
So there's no rocket motor on the satellite, so nobody is going to be able to change the orbit of the satellite and have it go out, go start interfering with anybody else. So that's good news. We can only change the orientation of the satellite. However, I won't talk too much about how it works, but we have, we have administrative layers in place between the game and the actual control systems that will prevent anything from getting, out of the situations we want it to be in. So, we're giving people a lot of control, but we're not just giving them direct access to every subsystem of the satellite.
So Mike mentioned that there's only 5 finalist teams. In looking at that list, one team, Poland Can into Space, has made it into the finals each of the previous years. That team actually won Hackasat 3 and placed second in Hackasat 1. Last year, Space Bits R Us came in second in Hackasat 3. The remaining teams were all new. But as evidenced by Space Bits R Us, which didn't take the finals for Hackasat 1 or 2, it seems that those new teams shouldn't be counted out, as surprises can and will happen in finals.
I can't be sure, but I think all the teams have participated in Hackasat before. It can be a little hard to say because we know that some teams from past years have joined forces with other teams to make an even better team. But Poland Can into Space, I think they've been in finals every year. They won last year. I think they placed second in Hackasat 2. So they're definitely a recurring team that we see a lot of good stuff from. Space Bits R Us is our second place team from last year. They made finals again this year. The other 3 teams weren't in the finals last year, but if you sort of look at the qualification rounds from all 4 years, you'll see sort of these same teams in the top. And it is very corollary with the teams that are, top in other CTFs, around the world.
Nations that are represented by these teams have included the United States, Germany, Poland, and Italy. So teams are one thing, but there are individual players. And in looking back at past teams, the players have moved around. Or, for that matter, whole teams have combined to improve their chances.
They've just either, combined forces or added players. Like Poland, Can Into Space is really P4 and Dragon Sector working together. That's who they are, right? And we know a couple other teams have done that as well. So, the top teams are definitely recurring. Even lower scoring teams. There's a couple teams that are in, say, the top 50 that I think if you go back, you'd see they were there every year. So we have a lot of the teams that really play. I think we have a lot of recurring players who have come back, which is great, right? It's what we want.
So when you're putting together a CTF team to go to DEF CON finals, you probably already know what you're going to need to bring. But when it comes to hacking a satellite, well, then we're talking about math and physics and orbital dynamics and things like that.
To me, it seems like you have to have your traditional hacking people. You need to have some people, especially for finals, that understand satellite ops and satellite ops operations. And as we've throughout the years, we've made the satellite operations part harder and more realistic. So you've seen the teams get better at that as we go. They weren't thrown into the deep end, quite as deep into the deep end as we could have thrown them in Hackasat 1. So good satellite ops people, and that means they need to understand the space physics, and what a satellite can do, and what the constraints are on talking with it, like contact windows and stuff like that. So
when I talk with people who are part of the Plaid Parliament opponent, which holds the record for the most CTF final wins, Ari, one of its players, told me that they were divvying up the tasks during the finals, that people you see on the event floor at DEF CON, they're working with teammates who are up in the suites and sometimes hammering out very specific problems for the team on the ground. Something similar happens with Hackasat.
I know one of the teams last year, I was asking them, how they had it set up, and they had like two rooms. They had like the satellite operations room during finals, and then they had the room that was focused on like reverse engineering code and finding vulnerabilities. And then when they had something they wanted to actually run on the real satellite, they would like go to the operations room and be like, okay, we've got this thing that we need to do. Like, how can we fit it into the rest of our schedule? And that seems to have worked a lot. But I'd also say, the skills start to blend. Like, I won't name names, but I've seen some people who are pretty prolific, CTF players, and they're like solving space math challenges in quals, or they're trying to debug why in finals their pointing of their antenna isn't right. So also great as we're seeing, we're not just seeing it as I'll be the hacker and you be the space math guy. People are trying to get this blend of skills, which is very powerful.
I'm wondering if Mike saw in Hackasat 3 or earlier ones where people started to approach the problem all wrong. Are there some gotchas that can be found in Hackasat?
That's an interesting question. I think at least what I would say, and the finalist teams don't quite do this as much. They tend to take their time to figure it out, is when people sometimes don't understand the math and they'll assume they have the right answer and things are just broken. And that we're not perfect, and sometimes things are broken and we fix them. But sometimes, maybe you just don't understand the math and you need to do more research. So the biggest gotcha we just see, I think, is people who need to keep learning the math. But the finalist teams mostly, when they're getting the wrong answer, they assume that they're wrong. And usually if they come to you privately and say, hey, we think this is broken, they'll tell you why. And we always take whenever somebody says something's broken, no matter who it is, we always take it seriously and look into it. But the finalist teams are often correct when they tell you something is broken.
Oh, that's interesting. So the teams can push back if they think something is broken or wrong, particularly if they are right. Sometimes, at least in the finals, they are. So, given the space physics and the math, are Hackasat teams adapting to that, or are they still sort of overwhelmed by it all?
The other gotcha really is just understanding space jargon and like terminology. Like there's a lot of it. And there's a ton of acronyms because that's how the US government works, I guess. And that's just a lot for people to handle. So I don't know if that's a gotcha, but it takes time to get up to speed on this stuff. I have multiple degrees and a bunch of experience, so it's all second nature to me. But a lot of these people are, especially early on, we're only seeing it for the first couple times. So, there's just a learning curve, and we've really seen, especially with the finalist teams, they learn pretty fast. There's just a learning curve, and we've really seen, especially with the finalist teams, they learn pretty fast.
Finally, there's just the enormity of it all. The idea that you could hack a live satellite.
I think it gets them at first. So like in Hackasat 3, for example, that was the first time we introduced contact windows, and we also introduced antenna pointing. So what we did is we gave them about a week before the game, we gave them a digital twin, and their satellite was in geostationary orbit, and they had a big antenna cone, like 120 degrees of range. So they just had to point it one time. And then they were good, right? And then on game day, all the satellites were in low Earth orbit. There were a bunch of different ground stations, and their antenna was like 10 degrees wide. So they had to track. So that was like a gotcha we threw at them early in Hackasat 3. And you could see it right as the game started. Everybody was pointing their antennas sort of all over the place. And then you'd see, one team would figure it out and start tracking. And by the end of the game, we could see everybody tracking their satellites along perfectly, or, pointing at other satellites. So that's a really good example of like where, maybe they didn't quite expect us to make it so hard, as we made it. But, they all figured it out pretty quick, during Hackasat 3. By midday on the first day of that, everybody was interacting with their satellite pretty reliably.
Well, I'd like to thank Mike Walker for taking the time out of his preparation for Hackasat 4. This is going to be really exciting, and it will be streamed. It will be carried live if you want to watch it from home. Or if you're at DEF CON, I'm sure you want to pay attention there. It's going to be in the Aerospace Village. Hey, if you're enjoying Error Code, tell a friend. I'm sure there are other people out there who like narrative information security podcasts. And I'd really like to hear from you. DM me at Robert Vamosi at infosec.exchange on Mastodon and tell me what you like and even what you don't. I have new shows coming up. Subscribe today. I don't want you to miss out.